Welcome to today's webinar, At Home with Uncertainty, Practical Outcome Mapping Concepts and Tools. My name is Pamela Teitelbaum, and I'm Consulting Director for Evaluating Impact with the Tamarack Institute, and it is my pleasure to introduce in this discussion our guest for today, Heidi Shafer. Heidi is founder of Advancing Change Together. ACT facilitates multi-partner collaborations, collective impact, participatory planning, adaptive learning, and evaluation. ACT supports programs and partnerships aimed at co-designing equitable and inclusive community health and well-being systems. She has a master's in transformative change and critical global and community issues, over 15 years of experience leading equity-focused strategy and performance measurement with organizations and networks in community health and social services. From 2010 to 2018, Heidi led knowledge, learning, and evaluation initiatives for the Ontario Alliance for Health Communities. Heidi is also chair of the Global Outcome Mapping Learning Community and has facilitated outcome mapping and outcome harvesting workshops in Canada and internationally. Heidi, it is a real pleasure to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I'm really excited. I'm excited because I'm excited to share my passion for outcome mapping, and also in this time of needing to embrace non-linear transformative change, how powerful I think outcome mapping and outcome harvesting are for that purpose.
So before we begin, let me just cover off on a few things, but thank you for your excitement. I also agree that we are living in a climate that outcome mapping can become a really valuable model and tools and approaches for people who are working in systems change work today. So let's just look at who's in the room. Before we get started, we should really just consider about the 650 learners from Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Singapore, Germany, France, Mexico, India, Ghana, and beyond. I mean, really, we have people from almost every continent on the call today, which is just fantastic. And also 250 learners that have registered to receive the recording of this webinar in follow-up. And again, also we have sectors-wide participation from the nonprofit community, education, health, as you can see, foundations, government, and consultants. This is just, it's a really broad range of listeners, and we're really excited to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us. So what's this topic all about? Really, I'm really looking forward to the conversation today with you, Heidi, because in our social change and evaluation work, outcome mapping, I think, is really an amazing offer and opportunity for our listeners to think about our work from a different kind of unique and diverse and dynamic perspective to other approaches that we know about. And really, we're just looking forward to learn from you and see what types of questions our listeners are going to have for us. Can you share a little bit with us to start with about what outcome mapping is about?
Sure. Okay, happy to do that. Wow, that's really exciting to see all the interest in outcome mapping now. This is kind of, I'm going to talk about outcome mapping kind of in as summary a way as I can to cover as much as I can in the time we've got available. So this slide is sort of summarizes the essence of outcome mapping. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't just situate us where we are. So next year is the 20th anniversary of outcome mapping. And it really grew out of the global sustainability movement, right? It was that stuff that resonates so much with you, Pamela, that rights-based, people-centered approach that puts people in control of their economies and leading in their common environment. And so it's grounded in that people-centered participatory approach. And it was the International Development Research Centre in Canada that were really trying to figure out how to support their research programs and to demonstrate the contribution of research to system change, which is really hard. Very, not linear causality, lots of messy dynamics, and lots of fluid change. And so they came up with outcome mapping. So at its essence, it kind of has these 6 characteristics. And so first of all, starting with observable behavior change. So any kind of sustainable ecological change or well-being change is going to rely on human behavior. And then our interventions are going to be limited. We have to recognize that we have a sphere that is limited. And nowadays, sphere of influence is not such a novel term as it was 20 years ago. And then at its core, it's nothing about us without us. It's really about people-centered change and people themselves having the knowledge and the power to lead and direct change processes that affect their system. The other piece I really like in this sort of applied system thinking approach is that, we have these great projects and initiatives, we have wonderful objectives, but that's not enough. We need to embrace different perspectives on change and understanding change from a more nuanced perspective. And we really need to be learners. And this kind of, not just learning about our practice, but learning about the way we're thinking, learning about the way we're being. And really profoundly, like outcome mapping fostering reflection and development. So it's really about learning. And then finally, this systems approach where, we don't just take the idea that everything's connected as a given, we embrace this interconnectivity in the way we plan our initiatives. So system, perspectives, and interrelationships and boundaries. What outcome mapping kind of does that is unique, and what it added to planning, monitoring, and evaluation that is unique, is it helped to set the boundaries within the system for change, and that's the sphere of influence. It also helped us to sort of figure out who the prominent actors were in the system that were really going to be the ongoing drivers of change, and that's the boundary partners or the system actors. And then also the milestones or the pathway to change, and that's these outcomes that are understood as behavior changes, progress markers. And these three core concepts are shared, so not just outcome mapping, but outcome harvesting also shares these concepts. So just talk a tiny bit about each one. The sphere of influence. This is, I've seen such a change in where our accountability is, how we're always accountable to these way downstream things. And so, of course, our sphere of interest and concern is downstream, but we don't have control in that space. So outcome mapping is a way to bring that change beyond our small sphere into that larger sphere by working with these social actors or these boundary partners within our sphere of influence. And
yeah, I love very much this whole notion, because it really does engage community, people involved in the experience itself, in the work of doing outcome mapping. And I think that's just one of the most profound parts of this experience.
Yeah, and I mean there's a continuum of participatory involvement if your boundary partners are highly aligned. So you might choose boundary partners because you all want to learn in the system. Maybe there's so much change in the system and you're all working in similar ways to improve inclusive systems or to improve climate action. And so you might choose boundary partners on the basis of that. You might choose boundary partners on the basis of influencing them to then influence their boundary partners, so with health centers to influence primary care practitioners in the way that they treat their clients. There's loads of tools in the outcome mapping toolkit that help us to figure out who are our boundary partners. But basically the main question to ask is, on whose actions does your success depend? And then that, begins to help you. Yeah. But then if you're taking an equity perspective, of course, you have to strategically choose boundary partners that can help to and build those relationships that can help to build that pathway for equity and inclusion.
Yeah.
So, and then finally, I mean, this is kind of, this is I think the main piece of it, the juice of the approach is that when we talk about what are outcomes are specifically, changes in behavior, actions, interactions, relationships, policies, practices of social actors, of our boundary partners. And that is, can be anything from individuals, groups, to institutions. I had a little quote here to slow me down, which is that the theory of change in any outcome mapping project is that change emerges from the collective impact of a suite of outcomes, so a suite of change behaviors in a group of key actors, each deliberately involved because of their strategic roles and interests in relation to the issues being addressed. So that's kind of a built-in theory of change, if you like, in these three core concepts. And outcome mapping is this sort of developmental journey that we take with our boundary partners paying attention to change along the way. So it's not like we map out and we know what change looks like and we've got it all mapped out. It's an intentional journey we take, and then we map it as we go. Oh, I'm muffled.
Yeah, pardon?
Oh, it sounds like someone's saying that my voice is muffled.
Oh, I hear you well, but perhaps maybe you could speak a little more loudly.
Up into my.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna say that you that quote really highlights already some of the benefits that outcome mapping has compared to other models that we apply. And so maybe can you speak a little bit more about what are some of the benefits of outcome mapping?
Yeah, I really want to talk about this because, outcome mapping, if you are in an organization and you have to build a case for outcome mapping, I think it's really important that you understand the benefits and that you're able to kind of convince and bring others along. And so in 2014, I think the Outcome Mapping Learning Community commissioned a study among practitioners to try to find out what was the value add of using outcome mapping. And I think what's really profound about it, about the results, is that it basically, outcome mapping supports more adaptive capacity because the quality of your reflection and the sort of the process of collecting and analyzing data is more rigorous. And so some of the benefits that were reported by the group were, there is more time set aside for data collection and analysis, for sense making. There's, as a result, there's more trust built. There's more learning about context. These are the self-identified benefits from the practitioners. There's strengthened relationships, and there's learning from these less tangible outcomes that come across. So I think this study, and I believe that I shared at the OM Barometer, is useful to read just in terms of understanding, why would I adopt outcome mapping? So if I really want to, if I see change behaviors as part of the work I'm doing, if I want to be more learning oriented and informed by emergence, and really sort of take more time to do the so what and the now what, outcome mapping is a really powerful tool.
That's amazing. And just so you know, everyone, Duncan just posted a link to the barometer that Heidi just mentioned in the chat box. So you're welcome to have a look at that. And I think now that we've sort of grounded the outcome mapping approach, then we can talk a little bit about what are some of the key skills that are priorities for people to know about, to have when they're wanting to engage with this model.
Okay, so Pamela kind of forced me to identify the three most relevant skills, and I kind of cheated because I sort of clumped a bunch of them together. And I'm going to talk about them all, and then I'm going to give a couple of examples. So basically, outcome mapping is a mindset shift. It really is about this movement away from attribution, sort of, from our activities producing outputs and moving more towards a systems approach for thinking about our contribution to behavioral changes and shared contributions. And that mindset around actor-centered behaviors and observable behaviors. That's a big one. The other one is about being able to facilitate change process. So you find a lot of people in the outcome mapping learning community that are like me. Come out of organizational development. I'm a learning system designer and a facilitator, and those skill sets are really important because we need to bring our boundary partners along and not force them along. We're working in relationship, and ideally, in its best use, we're supporting their ideal contribution to change. So we're supporting a developmental change process in our boundary partners. So we need to have those facilitation skills that are pretty and relationship oriented. And then finally, this deep kind of learning orientation I've talked about, in human systems dynamics or in any systems thinking, this idea of what are the patterns in the system, so what do they mean, and now what do we do? You have to have that muscle built, that culture of reflecting, right, and thinking about what are the implications of what we're seeing. So those are the three skill sets. And then I'm just going to give a couple of examples.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
excellent.
I'll try. These are a little hard. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but this is kind of fun. But how many of you have written like strategic plans or funding proposals, or that use this language? Greater awareness, better inclusive leadership, active participation. Well, of course we do. And in outcome mapping, we don't use these terms. We don't use them for two reasons.
Yeah.
We don't use them because they don't describe behaviors that are observable. Greater awareness, I admit, that's a really tough one. And we could have a whole session on what greater awareness looks like, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But also because terms like greater and more, they're in that old paradigm of attribution, right? If you have to demonstrate greater awareness, you need a baseline to say what was the awareness before and then what's the awareness after. And that's not what we're doing. We don't look to impact with attribution. We look at contribution to change. So I did create this this is very artificial, but it was for the purposes of this conversation today. So if we took some of those terms like changes in awareness or changes in collaboration, we would want to be looking at the actor-centered descriptive behavior change statements. And it would depend, of course, this is not embedded in a teaching case. So in the training, it would be. These are just examples of actors that, you could plausibly say, yeah, that represents a change, a behavioral change in awareness or collaboration. Or look, if the municipal council endorses a new policy, that's clearly a governmental commitment. So the only one I wanted to take a moment on was the one around capacity building, because outcome mapping is so beneficial for capacity building work, right? It's really designed for that, because what does capacity building look like, and the need to really elaborate what we mean by capacity building. And that partnership learning grant project that I said, that was all about the grantees finding at the end that they didn't really learn about what their increased capacity for collaboration looked like, and they wanted to use outcome harvesting for that. So in this case, I'm sorry to use an acronym, but CHC is Community Health Center. And then, so community health center managers, we would like to see them registering for this Indigenous cultural safety training and completing the training. That's within our, what we'd like to see. What we would really also love to see is them, using their sphere of influence and having purchasing spots for their staff, and then eventually like adopting new policies and practices all around embedding an Indigenous cultural safety approach. So that's that change pathway. And that's the mindset in a nutshell. And where we use this in outcome in the Alliance for Healthier Communities, this is just a quick story, but in the strategic plan, so this is a 5-year strategic plan, because we use these actor-centered statements within our sphere of influence, we were able to have 5-year actor statements, outcome statements. And that was very powerful for the Alliance, because I can't tell you how many key performance indicators there were, how many, accountability reports and business intelligence reporting systems. This is a health system, and it's big. And it's about demonstrating something they're not accountable to the government for, which is their social justice approach, their determinants of health approach, their community governance approach. But so we were able to kind of use this actor-centered thing to come up with a very inspiring statement around what change looks like in the future within the sphere of influence of the Alliance, which is their members. And again, we could talk about this for a while, but and then I have one more example around that learning orientation. And this is really about, if you look around at who's using outcome mapping, there are organizations that are extremely innovative. They realize that they're trying to measure things that are hard, in this case, anti-racist organizational change, or maybe they're trying to measure sense of belonging and that they can contribute to as a museum or as a community garden. They're really difficult things to measure, and that's where outcome mapping can really help. And one of the organizations that's leading in this area in Canada is this Indigenous Cultural Safety Program, and they have Indigenous-led rigorous research to demonstrate the impacts of their training. But the area that they really wanted to be learning-oriented about was the area of their partnership development. And the partnership development is really hard because it's unpredictable, right? Each like large health system, a hospital or Health Quality Ontario, they're going to be at a different stage. They can't map their way out of a racist system and understand what change is going to look like. It's going to be unpredictable. And so the Indigenous Primary Care Council and the ICS program used outcome harvesting and asked me to help them to develop a learning-oriented monitoring system so that they could understand their emergent contributions or their unpredictable contributions to change. And here is an example of a contribution to unpredictable systemic change. And that is that, that they were able indirectly to influence Health Quality Ontario, which is now called Ontario Health, now part of Ontario Health, to embed in the quality standards, a statement about the effects of colonization. So this was 2018, and hopefully by now there's a lot more of this kind of thing going on. But you can see how these kind of nuanced changes are very hard to predict and hard to see. So important to demonstrate.
Yeah, I was just going to comment actually on how interesting outcome mapping is when you're dealing with nuanced behavioral and social change, where there's sort of transformations taking place, but they're almost undefinable unless you start to look at more the influences that are happening around rather than just looking at what you're aiming to achieve with one particular project. So I think this is really fascinating.
Because they're not linear, right? They're not. They're exactly. Emergent. And that article that I wrote for Engage, I think, talks a bit about that sort of non-linear approach.
That's right. And Duncan's going to post the link to that article as well right now so that you can have an opportunity as listeners to have a chance to read that if you haven't already. One of the other interesting things that when we talked, I thought was really important was to help listeners to understand what they need to start to think about when they want to use outcome mapping in their work. And I think there's a few people who have written some questions in the question and answer that might have some questions answered through this response, but if not, we'll address those at the end.
Yeah, okay. So again, this is hard to summarize in a short period of time.
Yeah.
But so we have outcome mapping is about these 12 steps and these 3 phases, but it isn't meant to be like the 12-step program to a better project. It is meant to be adapted and used in ways that are meaningful to context. It's really all about, I think that's why I started with the thinking, because it's really all about what is the context and need, and then potentially some of these, this approach will be helpful. I think the most important piece is probably to think about the intentional design and that journey we take with our boundary partners and unpack that a little bit. So outcome mapping allows us to ask these key questions in our intentional design journey with our boundary partners. So the vision, and the vision is very specific in outcome mapping. It's really a very rich contextual description of the system with actors and their change behaviors as if it was real in the present. And then, the who. So again, I've talked a bit about that. Who are we working with? Can we influence in order to continue this change and sustain this change into outside of our spheres of influence? And then the what. The what is really about, the outcome challenge. Outcome challenge is like a mini vision statement. If you gave your boundary partner all the resources and support they needed to be completely successful, if they were ready for this, then they would describe what success looks like when they're maximally contributing to change. And that's where I think it's a collective impact kind of approach where that's built into outcome mapping because of these outcome challenges. And I use outcome challenges with outcome harvesting quite a bit in my work. And then progress markers, which are the behavioral milestones that are not linear. Like we know that change doesn't happen and sometimes people can change and then they change back. Mm-hmm. And there's dynamic elements. I don't want to give the impression that these are, incremental linear changes, but they are transformational. They're deeper and deeper levels of transformation. And then the how. Here I would have, if I were inventing outcome mapping today, I wouldn't use the word strategy map because in my field, strategy map speaks to a balanced scorecard and organizational strategic planning. But actually, that's not at all what a strategy map is. The strategies are key. They are the way in which we support change in our boundary partner. And it's more like a matrix that allows you to think about change within the environment of your boundary partner and change within the system, and make sure that we diversify our strategies. We're not just working at a capacity building level. We're not just working at a community of practice level. We're not just working at a direct investment of funding or research level. So that's strategy maps. And there are webinars coming up about strategy maps and about some of these other tools coming up in the outcome mapping learning community. And then you asked me one more thing, which I think was very helpful, which is how do you use outcome mapping with your existing tools that you're already using, or depending on the stages of work that you're working in. So basically any evaluation design is compatible with outcome mapping, whether using logic models or you're using theory of change or developmental evaluation or utilization focused outcome mapping can be combined there. And then in understanding the system, these are almost like pre-steps to outcome mapping. You really need to develop that rich picture of the system in order to figure out the boundaries and who you're working with. So there's lots of tools that we as practitioners all use around interest mapping, influence mapping, power mapping, that kind of thing. And also with equity work, a lot around impact assessment, around vulnerability analysis and things like that. They are all very compatible with outcome mapping. And then finally, qualitative information gathering methods. So outcome journals are how we monitor the behavior change, and there are lots of online versions of that. But there are some cool new tools like sense making, which collects those micro narratives if you've got the money to use it, and then most significant change, and appreciative inquiry. They're all very much aligned methods. They're part of the family. We call them a family of adaptive pluralist methods.
Wonderful. That's good. I think that this particular information around what it can be complementary to, we have a couple of questions where people were asking, how does it fit within developmental evaluation framework, or how do you apply two frameworks at the same time that are outcome mapping along with developmental evaluation or utilization focused? Or what kind of advice would you give to people on how to start using outcome mapping when they're already engaging with other evaluation methods? And
yeah, I mean, first of all, outcome mapping is grounded in utilization focused evaluation.
Right.
Who are your primary users? What are the primary use? And engaging your boundary partners as primary users in the evaluation. So it's not that the framework is incompatible, but it is that those core concepts, both with outcome mapping and outcome harvesting, of sphere of influence, limited sphere of influence, boundary partners, and outcomes as behavior change, those things need to be included and can very easily be included in practice and developmental evaluation for sure. How we understand and want to understand our influence on change. And there may be ways in which, as a developmental evaluator, you're perfectly situated to facilitate an outcome mapping process. I don't know if that helps, but let me get to the last. Yes. I think I have 2 slides left, and then I can maybe embrace questions better. So I just wanted to take a minute on this equity-focused outcome mapping work. I just wanted people to know that there's this work underway to identify principles, this principles-focused approach that support equity and equity practice. So I think we acknowledge that most of the, if not all, social justice movements are led by very vulnerable groups. And we need to have a set of ethical practices and principles to support our effective work with those groups, our inclusive, transformative work with those groups, and not repeating kind of oppressive forms of collaboration. So I'm happy to say that we've been working on this for a while, and we have a webinar coming up in August to share some of the principles that help in applying the concepts of outcome mapping.
That's amazing. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I think that's going to be good. And then,
yes.
sorry.
Back to the question. I jumped the gun earlier, but I wanted to give listeners a chance to hear, based on, especially because you're such a seasoned user and implementer of outcome mapping, and I would love to hear the kind of advice you have for people who want to start applying the method.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's really important to understand what your needs are. Why do you want to apply the method? What is the purpose? I'm not like a promoter of outcome mapping as to lead with a method. It's the thinking that it's the transformative, people-centered, participatory change that really got me hooked on outcome mapping. So if you think about, what is the need that you're trying to meet? So if it is about behavior change, as I've mentioned before, if it is about emergence and really embracing more emergent strategy, if it is about being more learning oriented, then this is a good method for you to start to apply. And you can do it in a number of different ways. You can really you can go to the outcome mapping learning community, which I have to say is a really unique community, very generous community of practitioners. Next year is the 15th anniversary of our community. We have about 1,700 members from 120 countries around the world. And there are resources there that they're very generous. You can post questions. You can find people that are maybe working in your area. Maybe you're working in climate change. Maybe you're working in arts and drama. Maybe you're working in, like me, in health and equity. And you can find people and they will respond to questions. But it's probably a good idea, to learn iteratively and to get a coach or to have someone who can mentor you. I was very fortunate to be mentored by Ricardo Wilson-Grau, the inventor of harvesting. Because what happens is you go back in and then all these questions come up and then it's like, well, how do I deal with these questions? And the manual is 20 years old. It has some great facilitation questions. And on the outcome mapping learning community, we have a practitioner guide with more. But, it's very much something you have to learn as you go along. And don't feel that you have to use it all, and don't feel that you have to declare you're using it. I've used outcome mapping by stealth for years and years, never saying I'm using outcome mapping.
Right.
Just adopting, right? Because there's too much resistance. Oh, well, we can't afford that. And here, Heidi wants us to reflect again, And so I think that it's okay to see which pieces of the thinking and the practice resonate for you, and just start small.
That's great advice. That is really great advice. So I think now we'll move into the Q&A part of our call, and we encourage you. Several of you have sent in questions and voted on them, and so maybe I'll just pass it over to Duncan, and he can start to facilitate this part of the webinar.
Yeah, thank you both, and thanks for everyone who's provided questions already. If you haven't, you can use the Q&A panel on the Zoom client, and if you don't have a question, you can still open it up and vote on which questions you'd like to see answered. The first question comes from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, what are the differences or similarities with collective impact and outcome mapping?
Okay, so I think that the similarities are related to, as I talked about, this idea of if you strategically engage a bunch of boundary partners in a system because of their common opportunity to have an impact in a vision on a similar issue, that's very similar to having a whole set of groups working together with mutually reinforcing activities, and then their outcome challenges, their individual visions of change, become that sort of way, the bite of the larger vision, and the collective vision is one thing, and then their piece of the collective vision is the other. And so in measuring their journey to contribute to that collective vision, that's potentially could be a shared measurement approach. And the strategies could also be a set of of activities that support that change. The way that it's potentially different is that the group, unless the boundary partners wanted to intentionally group themselves together and then design together the entire program, then that would be, and that's what happened in fact with the project I mentioned, that actually Tamarack was involved in, the partnership learning grants. It was the grantees that said, well, we didn't learn enough from this, and they worked together to understand how collective impact, how capacity building was supporting their ability to be more effective as networks and to collaborate, to be more aligned and more integrated in the system. So that's a kind of short answer. I think it is very similar, but it really depends on the relationship across the boundary partners, and if the boundary partners are working collaboratively and owning the project, that's collective impact. But if they're working with an initiative or program that's housed somewhere else, that's still the backbone, but the backbone is potentially separate. They may have a separate mission in it from that. Do you know what I mean? So that's a difference. Does that cover it, do you think?
Yep, I think that you.
That's a good question.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that's a really clear answer. Our next question also comes from an anonymous attendee. They ask, can you say more about what you mean when you reference boundary partners?
Sure. So it's a kind of funny term, and when I talk about using it by stealth, I don't use the word boundary partners when I'm using it by stealth. It's really about the social actors that are within your sphere of influence. So that if you did like a stakeholder rainbow or a stakeholder analysis where you're looking at interest and you're looking at influence over an issue, and you look at all the different kinds of actors within the system that you could potentially work with in order to extend your influence on beyond your sphere into your into a broader sphere of interest. So then those how you select the partnerships that you have are really critical. And so when you're looking at, as I mentioned it, when you look at your purposes, why are you wanting to partner to influence these particular organizations? Is it because their boundary partners are ultimate beneficiaries that you're seeking to help in the long run? Or is it because you're all working together to try to create change in a very complex system, and you want to understand who's changing in what ways? So this is key to outcome mapping. You have to anticipate working directly with boundary partners, and you have to anticipate having influence with boundary partners. They may be fully aligned and they may be partners, in which case you're closer to collective impact. Or they may be not as aligned and you need to influence them. Perhaps they're embedded, but you still have to anticipate working with them, but perhaps they're embedded in government or embedded in less aligned institutions. So there's a real spectrum there in terms of boundary partners. But they all are within your sphere of influence and people that you anticipate or groups that you anticipate working with. Otherwise, they're strategic partners, but they're not your boundary partners. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Christian, and they ask, how would you compare and contrast strategy maps and program logic models? I know we touched on this briefly, but they were looking for a bit more explanation.
Yeah, so they're very different because strategy maps are really the only indicators that you're focused on, and I'm using the word indicators loosely, but the behavioral change progress markers, so the developmental indicators or the qualitative indicators of change. That is all that you are focused on with a strategy map. You're looking at your boundary partners or groups of boundary partners that you want to influence in a certain way, and you're considering what are the strategies directly in the environment of my boundary partners that will bring about influence. Maybe I'm going to directly fund the boundary partners to have access to the internet. They didn't have access to the internet. Maybe I'm going to provide some kind of capacity building training in community governance or community leadership. Maybe we're going to build supportive networks. So strategies are at that level of understanding how to move your boundary partners in the direction of that behavioral change. They're not as broad as a program logic model. The logic would be the broader design of outcome mapping. It would be who you've chosen, how you're working with them, what the change looks like. It wouldn't just, the strategies are more specifically focused on your boundary partners and how to bring about and monitor change. So you'd monitor your performance of your strategies, you'd monitor outcomes as well, you'd monitor your own learning as an organization.
That. Our next question is also from an anonymous attendee, and I've seen this echoed a few times in the chat. At what stage of the project do you define project outcomes and indicators?
You can define them at any stage of the project. I mean, I think it depends on the complexity of the context in which you're working. If you're working in a highly complex context where there's continuous change and there's really so much change that you can't realistically plan, you need to understand the system. You need to build a really rich contextual picture of the system. In that case, you would use outcome harvesting. Who is changing in the system? In what ways are they changing? What actors are changing? And then you have the ability to figure out how to scale and support more change. If you are well on your way in thinking about your project, you might do an eco-cycle planning to look at the partners that you have and figure out which ones are mature, which ones potentially where there are gaps in partners in order to affect change. And in that way, you can then begin to define who you should be working with and what their outcome. The indicators and the outcomes are not separate things. Let's be clear about that. The behavioral change of your boundary partners as they are moving and evolving in the direction of really contributing maximally to the broader vision of change. Those are your indicators. I mean, in my field in healthcare, they often dismiss them as process changes, but they are behavioral, qualitative, developmental behavioral changes.
I think it's really interesting because I think one of the initial challenges when first being introduced to outcome mapping is changing the mindset, like we were talking about during of the concepts, and actually of looking at monitoring and assessment in through a different lens almost completely, because it's really looking at the relationships and behavioral changes, not tied as closely to a logic model in that sense.
Yeah, it's really looking at your sphere of influence and understanding, that your influence is very limited. And we're used to doing these evaluation designs that, where we are accountable to things that are way beyond our sphere of influence.
That's right. And we have to actually be accountable to those once we're applying them and writing them into our frameworks. So it's interesting. It's really interesting. I like the fluidity almost and iterativeness of the outcome mapping. And
I just thought of something that connects back to the question about collective impact. In a way, these behaviors are the enabling preconditions for change. So how in collective impact we talk a lot about that, right?
Yeah.
So if we look at these behaviors getting toward more sustained influences in the system beyond our sphere, these are like the enabling preconditions for change that we talk about in collective impact.
Yeah, thank you both. Our next question is, are things like declares and endorses observable behavior? What's the difference between saying something and doing it? Is saying something considered a behavior?
Yeah, so I mean, we get into lots of conversations about ideation too. Like in increased awareness in climate change, you would see people on a survey might declare their intention to behave differently. Now that I know more about recycling, I'm going to recycle more, or I'm going to change my behavior. And then there's a lot of arguments made that is an observable behavior that people have indicated on a survey that they plan to act differently. In an orthodox interpretation, like if Ricardo Wilson-Grau was still alive, he would say no, that unless you can observe those behaviors, they're not outcomes. You have to be able to observe behavior change. And this is where the rigor comes in this reflection, this adaptive capacity, where we continue to ask ourselves, what does increased awareness really look like? What are the changed behaviors? And what do they really look like? And so, that's something that we have to work at, and not slip into, I forget what this, Duncan, what was this? Can you just repeat that one part of it? The first part of it?
Yeah, so are things like declares and endorses observable behavior?
Well, declares and endorses definitely are observable behavior. Sorry, I got off on a tangent about awareness. But yeah, I mean, it's an actor-centered. So if it, like, who's declaring? When did they declare? That's completely validated behavior, observable behavior. Sorry. Yes, the answer is yes.
No, that's perfect. Our next question comes from Cassandra, and they ask, and imagine this first part in air quotes, Heidi wants us to reflect again. So that's something I've faced too. Can you share how you respond to folks feeling that there's too much reflection?
Absolutely, and this is a real culture change. I mean, outcome mapping comes out of international development, and I think that's because there's a stronger culture in international development around complexity, understanding how complex the work is, and the need to, adopt these methods that are more learning oriented. In our culture, in Canada, and many of our organizations, we're still, I think, stuck in more of a performance measurement framework, and we don't understand or appreciate the value of reflection. And I think right now we have a huge opportunity with COVID, because if you look at, validated, documented lessons learned and how we apply those lessons learned to, scaling new practices, or in the recovery, the COVID recovery, or the reconstruction of our systems, we can't do that without understanding what we've done that's worked and what we've done that hasn't worked. So it's, really, this is why I had to use outcome mapping by stealth sometimes, is that, it's exhausting to be the one that is asking people to think strategically through a learning lens. But I do find that it's catching up, the culture's catching up with understanding that in a continuously changing environment, strategic learning and being learning oriented, and develop methods like developmental evaluation, supporting that evidence-based learning, right? You can't do it without evidence-based learning. And so this is a method. This reflection around data, qualitative data, is an evidence-based approach to strategy development. Outcome mapping is really all about strategy in complex contexts, really.
Thanks for that. And I think that's a great segue into a question that we've seen pop up in the chat a couple times. And I'll just read one out from Marin. How would you recommend using outcome mapping by stealth? Can you provide any tangible examples?
Sure. So, when there isn't much appetite, when there's a fairly well embedded either results-based framework or accountability-based framework, and there isn't that much appetite within your organization, and that if you're embedded in an organization, for a whole new method and a whole new learning curve, which was the case when I worked with the strategic plan for the Alliance for Healthier Communities. We used a SOAR methodology, the strengths, opportunities, asset, resources. We used appreciative inquiry, and there was no appetite for also considering boundary partners and so on. And so instead, it was a kind of lens that I brought to the discussion when we talked about the change that was being observed. Who's changing? Who specifically is changing? And in what ways are they changing? And when people said, well, there's increased inclusion on boards of community health centers. Well, what does that really look like? What is that? What does increased inclusion mean? what are we seeing? What are the behaviors? So you become that sort of the person who has a very clear understanding of what an outcome is. And people appreciate that because we get confused between our objectives and our outputs. But if you are steadfast in saying that no, an outcome is an observable behavior change, always. And it's always actor specific, always. It gives you a certain confidence to interject this method by stealth without having to get folks to adopt this, broader kind of system mapping approach.
No, I love that. And I love the confidence part of it too. I think that's going to be really important. We have time for one or two more questions. I'm going to pull another question from chat, and this is from Chasey. Public sector policymakers are given significantly less time for outcome mapping. How can we increase the value of this science across the board?
Public policymakers are given less time. Interestingly, though, people who are working on public advocacy for public policy use a lot of outcome mapping. And there's something called the rapid approach, and you'll find out about it in the outcome mapping learning community. And it came out of the Overseas Development Institute that does a lot of advocacy for policy change. Because advocacy again is really hard to measure, and so it needs strategies like that. Within a governmental context, again, when there are high stakes performance measurement pressures, it's a paradigm shift. That is a kind of attribution based, positivist, randomized control trial impact evaluation culture that may not be compatible with outcome mapping. Outcome mapping is a mindset shift. So, when there's a mindset shift that can occur where government and departments can see their collective contributions to change and see those as results, as verifiable results, which they are. There's a rigor in outcome mapping and outcome harvesting. Then we'll see more governments, I think, adopting it. But it is a paradigm shift. And if you're in the old paradigm, good luck. I think that's a bit of cynical. I shouldn't say good luck. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
It's a challenge. It's a more challenging terrain.
Yeah, and it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Without that shift. So.
Wonderful. I think we have time to sneak in one more question, and this comes from Grace. Could you share more about outcome mapping as it relates to public engagement and other activities around awareness raising, especially among students, if possible?
Around awareness raising among students. Well, I have worked in a lot in awareness raising, particularly with public health. So in, say, 2007 and 2008, I've done lots and lots of training in public health to support awareness around a social determinants of health approach. And this shift from a lifestyle approach to public health and health promotion to a determinants of health approach. I don't have an example specifically around raising awareness with students, but I think this will help. So in doing lots of training with public health units, hundreds of people, we wanted to have a way of understanding, has awareness changed? What has been the contribution to an awareness change? And in doing a kind of collective visioning process, the Peterborough Public Health Unit, for example, created a shared vision in 2008. And the shared vision was, poverty is bad for health. And that really was a kind of a huge behavioral change indicator, if you like, of a change in awareness on the part of the entire public health unit, because they had a shared vision they all ascribed to. And so, as I said, awareness is hard to measure, but if you're doing, engagement with youth, I think working around, just really describing what change looks like together, what ideal change looks like from the perspective of the youth themselves, and them then kind of referencing those change behaviors or that change system as something that is theirs or that they see themselves being able to contribute to. I think that is an indicator of changed awareness. But we'd have to have coffee to really talk this.
That's going to be next.
Yeah. Get in touch with me, because I mean, there are probably resources on the outcome mapping learning community about community engagement, youth engagement, and some of the kind of change pathways, because there are some common change pathways that have to do with increased understanding and then rejoining with others, and then more sustained change processes.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Just looking at the time, it's bringing us to the end of our discussion. So I hope that we got to answer as many questions as we could. And to everyone who's listening, I just wanted to, first of all, say thank you so much to Heidi. She's just an amazing wealth of knowledge and resource. And we look forward to having more conversations in the future. And I wanted to also just plug a little bit that she'll be facilitating a workshop October 20th and 21st. It's a fundraiser for the Outcome Mapping Learning Community. The workshop is entitled Advancing Systemic Change Process in Canada with Outcome Mapping and Outcome Harvesting. And you'll be able to find more information about this on the Outcome Mapping Learning Community website. Just keep your eyes peeled for that. And we are very thankful that you all were able to participate today. So thank you again. And Duncan, I believe, do you have any announcements?
Yeah, thank you both. Just a few quick announcements before we leave. Through the month of June and into July, the Tamarack Institute is excited to bring you free weekly community building webinars like this one to help equip you for community change as we all adjust to a new normal. You can join us for webinars on a variety of topics like engagement, systems change, community engagement, accountability, and much more. And if you can't make the live event, you can still register in order to receive a full recording of this discussion. As well, in a few days, you'll receive a follow-up email from me, which will include a full recording of today's call, any additional resources that were mentioned during the course of the discussion, and a copy of the slides. And if you want to learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.